Hi everyone, this is Jason Birak of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest. He is joining me from Japan, James Corbett of the Corbett Report. Thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, James, I understand as part of your background, you used to work with the international forecaster Bob Chapman. Many of our listeners, they've been in the gold and silver community for a while and looking for alternative media views of what's going on in the world. I used to listen to Bob Chapman, on Gold Seek Radio every single week. I thought he was a very smart analyst, and he had good contacts in the military and government, former people. I thought he was a really good analyst. Do you think, in your opinion, since you worked with him, would he be surprised that the game has been kept going this long?
Well, I think, first of all, for your listeners out there who do remember Bob, we just passed the 3-year anniversary of his passing away, actually. So that's a significant anniversary that we've just passed. And I think it is interesting to look at what's happening now in relation to what he was talking about even just a few years ago before he passed away. And given that opportunity that I had to interview him on a weekly basis, one of the things that I was struck by whenever I tried to corner him on a time frame for the sort of disintegration of the current QE disaster that I think we've all seen coming for a long time, whenever I tried to pin him down on a time frame for that, he was always the one who said, well, they're going to kick the can down the road with this or that program. More so than any other analyst that I heard, he was always saying in terms of a time frame of years, they can keep it going for a very long time. And he was the one who convinced me that the apocalypse wasn't exactly going to happen overnight like a lot of the other analysts were saying at the time. So if anything, I think that the last few years have vindicated Bob's position, although I think in the long run, I think we're all converging on that idea that the QE disaster is going to disintegrate. But I think he probably had the longest time frame of any of the analysts that I spoke to.
That's very interesting. There are a lot of analysts out there that try to make up like a, put a time window, it's a couple months from now, or, it's 6 months from now, or, it has at most 1 or 2 years. And, we've heard, I don't know about you, James, but I've heard this since 2008, 2009. And, I think really one of the main reasons is that since really before 2008, there wasn't the infrastructure in place for another legitimate, global financial system. So there wasn't an alternative SWIFT system. There wasn't all these currency swaps in place. They didn't have all these other things in place needed to store trade reserves and things like that. And I think that's why, a lot of other analysts, and there's analysts out there like Doug Casey and Jim Rogers, who have been, if you go back and read some of their works like Crisis Investing and Doug Casey or a lot of Jim Rogers interviews from the 80s and 90s, they thought the collapse could happen then. And it's been kicked. The can has been kicked down the road a lot longer than very, very smart people have thought.
Right, and to be fair to that point of view, I think that there is every reason why the system as it currently exists should not have lasted as long as it has. But it's only through the type of insanity that we've seen in the last several years specifically that has swept through the markets that has really totally, utterly detached the markets from any semblance of sanity, of normal functioning. So I think that people who have their heads screwed on straight should be marveling at how the system is still going, because obviously it just has nothing to do with the economic fundamentals anymore. And I should also mention for people out there who did follow the international forecaster that the forecaster did continue going. It's now the editor-in-chief is Bob's daughter, and I'm actually the chief editorial writer, so it still is put out on a twice-weekly basis.
Yeah, very good. And something else about, why the game has been kept going, if I can add some points there to what you said. I think one of the main reasons why the game has been kept going is there's very smart people. These people, they don't see the world the same way you and I do, James, but they see the world as, we need to keep these government systems in place. We need to keep growing government. These are not dumb people. They just view the world completely different than ours, and, they believe in central planning and big government and Keynesian economics, but they're not stupid, and they're very hardworking, and, they're willing to change the rules. I think one of the big things is, they just keep changing the rules. So when we think, they can't do another money printing program, well, here comes a new type of money printing program that no one thought was possible that they could do. And we've seen this, whether it's Greece or so many other examples of just new types of alphabet soup programs, whether it's currency swaps or these other things that they can bring into power. And they've managed to, I think, also keep a lot of the inflation. And obviously there's a lot of inflation. There is a lot of gasoline that's been stored up waiting for a match. but most of the inflation has not hit the real economy yet. A lot of it's just been, I guess, kept in asset prices, whether it's stocks, bonds, or real estate.
That's exactly right, and I think really as we know, markets are fundamentally about trust and faith and confidence, and it's about perception. And I think that basically the central planners, the central bankers, have been playing on that and basically daring the public to blink. It's almost a game of chicken, and I think there's probably no better example of that than here in Japan, where we now have the Nikkei at 15-year highs. We haven't seen the Nikkei at these levels, the Nikkei 225, since 2000, which is total insanity. It has absolutely nothing to do with the economic fundamentals of anything happening here in Japan, especially when you actually look at the numbers and you find that last year the inflows of foreign investment in the Japanese stock markets was down 94%. In fact, the month of April 2013 alone registered 3 times as much foreign investment in the stock market as the entirety of 2014, and yet we have the Nikkei 225 at 15-year highs. It has nothing to do with what's going on economically. It is completely about the fact that the BOJ is now openly, admittedly, on the record, unashamedly buying directly from the Japanese stock market. They're buying ETFs. They're encouraging the GPIF, the Government Pension Investment Fund, the largest pension fund in the world, to invest in the stock market, not in Japanese bonds anymore. This is just total insanity. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the Japanese economy, and yet it's having significant and wonderful results, I guess, if you're invested in the Nikkei, at least for now, until the bottom falls out of that. But it really is just kind of daring the public to call them out on the fact that the emperor isn't wearing any clothes.
I actually wanted to ask you questions about Japanese culture because I find their culture very interesting. I watched a number of Japanese movies, like their fighting and war movies and history and stuff, and some anime stuff and subtitles, just to learn about Japanese culture. I've also interviewed a number of other people who live in Japan. Now, you mentioned the Japanese stock market is going up, but I've heard from other people I've interviewed who live in Japan that the majority of Japanese people don't really care about the stock market, or, they don't know which companies to research. They don't really care about their investments that much. And the way, I guess, Japanese culture is, it's fairly subservient, is if the Japanese government, ordered the Japanese people to say, you know what, you have all the savings and we have a crisis here in our bond market and we need you to buy these Japanese government bonds, that most Japanese citizens would basically, surrender their savings and just buy the Japanese government bonds to save the government without, much objections.
Not only would that happen, that's exactly what has happened for generations. So yes, the majority of the Japanese citizenry has traditionally bought Japanese government bonds as their primary form of savings and investment, and that has been something that they've adhered to for generations. So that Japan does have an incredible debt to GDP ratio, but most of that debt is internal. It's mostly owed back to the Japanese public. In the form of the bonds that the public is buying for their savings, and then those who are also relying on the pension fund, like the GPIF, well, that's primarily invested in bonds in the past as well. Very, very safe. Very no one that I know is, or very few people that I know here are personally in the stock markets and invested in that way. Most people are going through the bond route, and that's been traditionally what's happened, which is why I think part of this Abenomics is to try to drive people into the stock market, to theoretically, supposedly, get people investing in the actual productive economy again and getting something kick-started here, which is pie-in-the-sky pipe dream. But at any rate, that's, I think, the at least what they're telling people is the idea. And I think you're right about the fundamental mindset here is subservient, and people just tend to follow whatever they're being told to do. And it was during the U.S. occupation, I believe it was MacArthur or someone in the MacArthur administration here who called Japan a nation of children. And sadly enough, that can be true in certain respects, as basically people will do whatever the authority figures tell them to do. And if you just have a nice coordinated advertisement campaign with a cute cartoon character, basically most Japanese people will fall in line with whatever they're being told to do.
Yeah, isn't the saying in Japan, the nail that sticks out will get hammered, right? That's one of the main things I think I've heard from Japanese culture. Is there a decent amount of entrepreneurship in Japan, or is it mostly only done through like research and development, like at a large company like Toyota or Sony or Honda or something like that?
Yes, it's a primarily corporate-driven economy with the big-name corporations, and it's in fact a well-ensconced system that I talked about recently on my podcast. It used to be known as the Zaibatsu, which goes back to Edo, Japan, but primarily since the Meiji Restoration until World War II. There were a handful of corporations, 4 major ones, and then a few other subservient ones that basically ran the entire Japanese economy, or the majority of it.
Yeah.
And
have you seen Tekken, the video game?
I have not, no.
Oh, it's about like the evil like corporations that run people's lives. There's like 2 corporations and they like control everything. They fight wars. It's just
well, sounds about right actually from the Japanese perspective. So you had like Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, some of these major corporations that were really kind of family-owned enterprises that monopolized various sections of the Japanese economy. After World War II, they were broken up under the U.S. occupation. There was the drive to break them up and seize their assets. But ultimately, all that resulted in was just a sort of reordering of that economy. So now, instead of the Zaibatsu system, it's the Keidetsu system, and it's the very same corporations. Now you have the Mitsubishi Sumitomo Banking Corporation and things like these, which are really just mergers of the old Zaibatsu. And now, instead of family-owned enterprises, they're shareholder-owned enterprises, but they still monopolize much of the economy here. So there is room for entrepreneurship, but not a whole lot. And especially when you factor in on top of that you have the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, as another layer of almost like a government in and of itself that also sits atop that economy and makes sure that no one cuts into anything that could cut into their profits. It's a highly, highly controlled and organized economy.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard of really any famous small companies where, they didn't start many, many decades ago. I haven't heard of any recent ones that were Japanese that have had massive amounts of success where, here in the U.S. with Silicon Valley, there's app company entrepreneurs and Airbnb and Uber and how quickly they can grow. And Japan loves technology, right? You'd think that they would have these, but they don't.
Well, I can only think of a few, and Uniqlo for one, and Rakuten. But these are just isolated examples. And interestingly enough, a lot of these examples involve these types of maverick types of company owners who are seen to be going against the grain, and often end up in a lot of trouble because of that. There was someone here a few years ago, Horie, known affectionately as Horiemon to the Japanese public, who was attempting to do some pretty unconventional things, arguing for shareholders' rights and things, and eventually got thrown in jail for corruption charges, which I'm sure could be leveled against any number of business owners here, but he got singled out because he was going against the grain. So that's kind of the way it works here. There are some examples of some companies that have come up in recent years, but they're few and far between.
That's very interesting. Now, you talked about corruption and some other stuff. What's your opinion on what's going on in Fukushima? Are we hearing, like, I guess the mainstream media, the news cycle has kind of gone off of it. I saw on RT that there was a story in the last couple weeks about a hydrogen cloud or something like that. So are things still getting really bad at Fukushima?
Well, I don't know if getting really bad is the right way to frame it, but certainly it is still very bad. And I think the core problem is the cores, the melted through cores of the reactors, which we know there have been melt-throughs in 1, 2, and 3, reactors 1, 2, and 3, but we don't know where those cores are lying. We don't know what the condition of them are, because at this point, there is literally no technology exists that can even get close enough to even see where these cores are lying. They've sent in numbers of robots, and they've all malfunctioned before they even get close enough to detect where the cores are. So that's really what the absolute central problem here is. And until there's even a way to assess that problem, I don't think there's going to be any fundamental progress at the site. So we hear about all of these other things that are happening. For example, there's the groundwater flowing through the site that becomes radioactive as it flows through the reactor buildings, and then it has to be collected up, and they're storing it in tanks, and the tanks are leaking, and all of these other problems. But all of those are kind of ancillary problems to the central problem of these cores. So again, the technology to even begin addressing this problem doesn't even exist yet. So that's, I think, the fundamental point of this. And so, of course, in the end of 2011, the TEPCO and the Japanese government said, oh, it's in cold shutdown, everything's okay. And the global media more or less abandoned it at that point. But obviously, this is still a problem. It's still ongoing. It will be for the foreseeable future. And in fact, they're just starting about they're starting to talk about starting to collect fuel debris from the plant in 2021, which you will notice is 1 year after the Tokyo Olympics. So I think they want to try to sweep this under the rug as much as possible before the Tokyo Olympics, and to make sure that nothing will disrupt that little cash cow, or what they hope will be a cash cow. And then after that, maybe they'll start revealing some of the real problems at the site.
That's very interesting. I spoke with a technology expert right as the Fukushima disaster was happening. There's a triple whammy: earthquake, then tsunami, then Fukushima. And he was saying, because he spoke with some of the engineers who were involved in building the actual Fukushima plant, that there was a lot of corners cut at the time. So I don't know if it was large corporations or it was a government-sponsored enterprise or something, but they built the nuclear power plant that was built there. There was a lot of design flaws with it that everyone was aware of, when the plants were built. So
That's right. And just to back you up on that, I did a report a few years ago called Marks to Market, America's Nuclear Time Bombs, noting that the exact reactor design used at Fukushima is a GE Mark I containment system, and that is currently in 23 different reactors in the United States, 32 around the world, the exact same design, and they have had problems. In fact, in the early 1970s, there were 3 GE engineers who actually resigned from their engineering jobs at GE specifically because they were concerned about the design flaws in the Mark I system. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was forced to issue new guidelines for those reactors in 1980, which mandated various upgrades to the design, and that was implemented in different ways by different operators. And I think the Japanese operator TEPCO obviously is now infamous for having cut a lot of corners along the way. So I think, yes, this was baked into the cake. And interestingly, I've talked to Arnie Gunderson of Fairwinds Energy Group, who was a nuclear reactor operator for a number of years, and he said before Fukushima happened, he was asked what is the most likely type of nuclear disaster we're going to see next in the nuclear power industry, and he said it will almost certainly be a GE Mark I reactor with this type of problem. So this is something that's been known about, and this is why the Japanese government official verdict eventually was that Fukushima was a man-made disaster. It was created because of the complete, utter, total chaos of TEPCO and their operation.
Yeah, I agree. There was a lot of design flaws, and then corners were cut. Like electrical systems weren't built on a full backup; they were tied in, and then the generator, the diesel generator, there was no concrete over the top because they didn't anticipate a tsunami, which is just ridiculous because they were near the water. And there's so many things that went wrong there. But the thing is, like, a lot of these nuclear power plants, James, they were built so long ago, and most of them were only designed for 3 or 4 decades. The people who built the plants anticipated there being plenty of money for brand new plants to be built like within those 3 or 4 decades and replace them, and yet we haven't done that. And a lot of these nuclear power plants, whether it's the United States or Japan that are very old, they've been upgraded, I'll use that in quotes, with bubble gum and duct tape.
Yes, and sometimes quite literally duct tape. There was a lot of that type of revelation in the summer after Fukushima. There was a few problems at some plants in the United States, and some problems with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's oversight of the reactors started to come out. But once again, that's been sort of brushed under the rug, and no one's really talking about it now. But it's interesting, that these problems still exist, and in reactors all around the world, including in the United States. But they get a lot. They don't get a lot of attention anymore, and I think that's obviously related to Fukushima, and it brought some issues to light. But now that it's been swept under the rug, so have all those other issues.
Yeah, it's definitely some stuff that people have to pay attention to about Japan, along with their, I think, impending currency crisis. We have listeners to our program from around the world, and some of our listeners in Japan, they share with me photos. They show me how, like, their portions at the grocery store or food or beer cans, how they've shrunk due to inflation, and the price may stay the same, but the portion size has shrunk quite a lot. So the units, the amount of beer or spinach and stuff like that has shrunk. So I guess that's called shrinkflation.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't be surprised at that. I'm about as observant as I think most men are when they go grocery shopping, so I haven't kept my eye on that. But I can say from my personal experience living here for 11 years now that any idea that there's been any deflation in any core consumer items is, I think, ridiculous. I haven't seen it on my side at all. If anything,
they're playing the same games as the Keynesians here in the United States.
I think so. I mean, certainly food prices and things haven't gone down at all since in the time that I've been here. And gas prices have gone down recently, but that's related to the oil markets. It has nothing to do with the Japanese, currency or anything that's going on economically here. So yeah, I think the idea that Japan is in some sort of deflationary cycle is a bit of those kind of Keynesian tricks. But certainly, I think that it's just a disaster economically speaking, and perhaps the best way to chart that disaster is just in the real wage declines that have been happening for month after month after month, year after year here. And I can't remember. I was checking month by month. I can't remember how many months we got up to. Maybe 23 months of straight real wage declines, which is the absolute signal that Abenomics, whatever it claimed to have wanted to have been, was a complete and utter disaster from its inception, because it did nothing to change that. Of course, the whole point of this is supposedly to get companies spending again, and obviously increasing wages, and then increasing wages will lead to people purchasing more in the economy. None of that has transpired. All it has done is inflated the stock market. So it's had zero effect on the economy and really just painted Japan into even a tighter corner.
Yeah, I think a currency crisis is mathematically guaranteed at some point, because I don't see the demand for the Japanese government bonds, the Japanese government, Japanese citizens, the private sector is going to run out of capital to buy up the bonds, and then the central bank's going to have to print, more yen to buy up the bonds, because they're trying to, part of the Abenomics you mentioned is financial repression. They're trying to keep the value of the bonds up and force the interest rates down. The United States is doing it. Europe is doing it. I think China is now even doing it. I know you want to talk about China, but I think Japan is going to have a very serious currency crisis. I think they're further along the road in terms of the developed world than any other country in the developed world for currency problems ahead.
That's absolutely right. I completely agree. And in fact, the pressure on the bonds is coming from every possible angle, because what you have is not just that there's going to be increasing pressure for the private sector to pick up the slack in purchasing more and more Japanese government debt, but there's the demographic crisis that's unfolding here as well. In fact, the last couple of years, Japan has actually had a shrinking population. It is now a dying country, and that's only going to accelerate from here on out as the population ages and more retirees join the retiree force, and the workforce that supports them dwindles down in relative size. It is becoming a demographic crisis. Exactly. And so now what we have is
the robots will take care of them.
Exactly. Well, and that is kind of what they're trying to bring in. But what we have now is we have a generation of workers who have worked their whole life and saved their whole life in Japanese government bonds, who are now cashing those bonds in and aren't buying any more as their retirement nest eggs. And you have these young workers who can barely afford to purchase bonds, let alone to purchase them in the kinds of volumes that the previous generation was. So I think this is, there's absolutely no way out of this that I can even imagine at this point.
I completely agree. I think the only way they can even keep the system going is by basically destroying the yen.
That's it. I don't think there is an alternative. We can make fun of the Bank of Japan for what they're doing, but I don't really think there is an alternative from within this paradigm for them to do anything else. Well,
they could write off the debt and take a hit, but then their banks are toast, right? Because the banks need higher asset prices, and they're using leverage in the system, and the bonds are collateral, and then it's whether or not you want to take your medicine now or you want to delay things. I guess the politicians and the bankers have decided they're going to delay things as long as possible, and it'll be someone else's problem in the future.
That's exactly right. And they made that decision almost a generation ago now in the late 80s, early 90s when the bubble popped here, and they kept the banks afloat. And so now there are zombie banks infesting the Japanese economy that were never shaken out of the system as they should have been. And they continue to limp along because they are papered over with these types of ridiculous things that the Bank of Japan is doing now. And of course, we should remember that the 80s bubble here was a complete invention, a creation of the central bank, which was using window guidance to mandate a certain amount of lending into the economy. And they were continually increasing it during the 1980s to the point where banks were thinking they were going to lend a certain amount, and the central bank would come along and tell them, no, you're going to lend triple that amount. And suddenly they were making...
Sounds like China.
Exactly right. Yes, no, it was a flood of credit that flooded the system here in the 80s that created the bubble. And when that popped, the government didn't let the banks die, and so now they're just zombie banks that are precarious and will... I mean, it's scary to contemplate what can happen here economically, and I think whatever happens globally, I think Japan is going to be on the front lines of it.
Now, shifting gears, since you live in Japan, and Japan has such a large trade relationship with China, even though there's so much, I guess, hatred or blood feud between the two cultures, they still do a lot of business together. It looks like China is in the process of planning a quantitative easing program. I mentioned earlier that they're going to try financial repression. It looks like the Chinese government owns most of the banks, I guess state-run 90% of them or something, and they're going to force the municipalities to sell the bonds to the Chinese state-run banks. The duration of the bonds is going to be expanded longer. The interest rates are going to be driven down. With all that being said, though, China is still producing, massive amounts of capital and savings for its citizens. Do you think China is positioning itself for the world reserve currency, or do you think that they only they want to take things much, much slower, and they only want to just gain slow steps and acceptance into the SDR?
Yes, I certainly don't think they're going to jump straight into trying to be a world reserve all at once. Perhaps that is a long-term strategy, but it's not feasible, it's not likely, and I don't think they're aiming for it in the short term. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I mean, they're only just starting to really internationalize the renminbi right now and to make it fully convertible. So it would be, I think, a few steps too far, but we don't have to speculate about what their plan is. The governor of the People's Bank of China for years now, I think since 2009, if memory serves, has been explicitly arguing that they want the yuan included in the SDR basket. So this is something that has been on the books for a number of years. They've been working towards it. Obviously, it was rejected in 2010, but now that the next review is coming up later this year, and we've had every indication from the IMF this year that all thumbs are up, and it looks like the yuan is going to be included. So again, it'll happen either this time or at the very least by the next basket review in 2020. But it is going to happen that the yuan will be included in the SDR basket. And I don't know, I'm not a mind reader, but I think that is at this point what China is looking for, is ultimately to get not necessarily to become the world reserve currency, but to make sure that the current unipolar U.S. dollar reserve currency system is not the economic order for the 21st century. So I think they've been working towards the internationalization of the renminbi for the last few years, and it looks like we're at the point where it's crossing over, and so we might be moving away from a U.S. dollar reserve system and more towards one of a multilateral framework like the IMF SDR.
Yeah, there's a lot of gold bugs, James, out there who are saying that China wants, sole world reserve currency. They're going to have a gold-backed RMB, or they're going to have a gold-backed, their own SDR basket. It's only going to be, I interviewed Alistair McLeod earlier last week, and he said that China doesn't really care that much about the SDR anymore, which I disagree with him about. But he said that China wants an SDR basket with the other Asian economies. It seems to me, though, that, a lot of the Chinese people there, they are Western educated. Some of them did work on Wall Street, but they seem to have went to Ivy League schools or schools in London, and they do adhere mostly to Keynesian economics because they are still doing, massive central planning with their infrastructure projects. I don't know how happy they would be about a fully backed, gold currency. Maybe in the future, a decade from now or something longer. I obviously, I won't dispute they're buying massive amounts of gold. They're at least buying 100% of the annual mining supply. But I don't think they're buying that gold to fully back their currency, because then their currency would be too strong for exports. I think they're buying that currency for insurance on their paper and to hedge their paper wealth, their paper reserves.
I think you're exactly right about that. I don't see them going for full gold backing, because it would put that damper on that credit creation that we know has been the only driver of Chinese growth in the last several years. Of course, we had the phenomenon of the boom of the early 2000s for China, which was predominantly based on the back of the boom of the export economy and generally the things were going okay in the global economy in the early part of last decade. But then after the Lehman crisis and meltdown and the drop-off in exports, there has been a question of how could China maintain that momentum. And so what we've seen, of course, is this incredible creation of credit in the last few years. And just to put that in perspective, there's lots of different ways to do it. But if you look at the total bank assets in China versus the U.S. and the change in those assets from 2009 to 2013, you'll see that the U.S. banking system went from around $12 trillion to about $14 trillion in that time frame. The Chinese system went from around $12 trillion to about $25 trillion. It's just insane the amount of creation of credit that's gone on in the Chinese banking system under the purview of the Chinese government, obviously, in that time frame. And if they went for full gold backing, obviously they would have to put the brakes on that process. And who knows what that would do to the Chinese economy, which they are trying desperately to try to get some domestic demand to fill in and to basically reorient the Chinese economy away from that export dependence. But until that happens, I think they definitely do not want to try to fully back their currency.
Yeah, I agree. I think like having listened to some of the speeches from the Chinese central bankers, read them or listened to speeches from them, and also seen their educational backgrounds. I don't think they've read the Austrian School of Economics, or at least most of them had. Now, they have had conference calls with GATA, their sovereign wealth funds have, about gold market manipulation, but there's some friends I talk to that think they could be manipulating the gold market too, or hiring someone to do it so they can get as much, metal, as much physical gold as they can as cheaply as possible. I know Jim Rickards has theorized that since 2011, which is when the precious metals price, the cyclical bear market started after many years run up in price, that the Chinese government made a deal with the U.S. government to help knock the price down so they could get more and more gold because they viewed that they didn't have enough gold.
I don't have any data to back that up, but I can say that it would absolutely flabbergast me if that wasn't the case. I'm sure that China is not only taking advantage of artificially lowered gold prices, but making that happen in order to facilitate the incredible amounts of imports that they've been doing in recent years, and of course have come to rival India as the world's largest gold importer, and depending on the year, are the world's largest gold importer. So I think they are definitely taking advantage of what's going on right now, and I would be surprised if they aren't at least somewhat behind the manipulation.
Do you expect China to stagnate massively and potentially bust like Japan did after their property bubble burst in Japan and the stock market bubble bursted?
I think that would be the logical thing to conclude. But again, as we talked about earlier, the logical thing, the sane thing that sane commenters might see is not necessarily what's going to happen. And I think there's a lot of different ways to look at that. One of them is the phenomenon, for example, of the dollar bull run that we had last year and early part of this year, which wasn't really based on anything fundamentally in the American economy or markets, but was, of course, just based on best-looking house in a bad block phenomenon. And I think we can see that those types of events can truly change our calculus when it comes to these types of things. And one thing that I found very interesting, I just saw the other day the Global Times, which is an adjunct of the People's Daily, which is, of course, a government-run media entity in China, and the Global Times is an English language one that tends to publish some more controversial ideas, and I think it's really used as a sort of arm's length way for the Chinese government to float and to test some ideas. And they had an interesting editorial about China's inclusion in the SDR basket the other day, where they were talking about how it's not just a question of whether the yuan gets included, it's a question of the weighting, because of course this is a weighted basket. And they were talking about how within the SDR, basically you have the two blocks. You have the UK, US, Japanese yen block, and then you have the European block. And before, back in 1981, when the SDR was launched, that was the German mark and the French franc. And so that was a sort of German-Franc alliance versus the UK, US, Japan block within that SDR. And this editorial was talking about that, and basically talking about how there's two factions within the SDR basket itself. Now, that's really interesting, because then in that editorial, they started to say, well, if we were included, we would probably be part of that European bloc against the UK, US, Japan bloc. So it was almost like they're trying to float the idea of some sort of China-Euro alliance currency bloc, something along those lines. And within that framework, I mean, let's imagine, for example, if the Eurozone continues to basically disintegrate, as it has been for a number of years, and as the Greek crisis seems to be forcing to a head, if China came in and said, we will backstop what's going on in the Eurozone with our, whatever, 20,000 tons of gold or whatever they actually have, I mean, that could be a complete game changer that would totally change our calculus on what's going to happen in terms of how this unfolds, because it would change international, not just the international markets, but international geopolitics itself. Again, that's highly speculative at this point, and I'm not predicting anything, but it is interesting to think about how those types of game-changing events can come along and just completely knock over whatever types of calculus we might have based on what we know at the current time.
Well, China is, to add to your points there, China is working on a new Silk Road alliance, right, of trade negotiations where it's the old Silk Road with the old stops there through, Istanbul and up through part of Europe, so through the Middle East. And so they're working on that. And I think they're also working on building a very large bullet train railway network from China to Russia. So they are making key trade alliances. China and the U.S. used to have a pretty good trade relationship, but now with the U.S. Trying to make China, trying to annoy China, I guess, in the South China Sea, China, I think, is starting to get antsy about dealing with the U.S. I don't know if you saw this, but the billionaire George Soros, who I think he's a hypocrite and his politics are very shady, he's actually predicting the U.S. and China will start World War III.
Yes, and I mean, let's keep in mind this is the same Soros who has just been discovered. Everyone kind of understood this anyway, but we've just got the email hack that shows that he has been influencing things in Ukraine to bring that crisis to a head. So again, this isn't necessarily a prediction so much as something that is a game plan for someone like Soros, who we know is behind so much funding of so much instability in so many different countries, and has been for a number of years, of course, I think quite infamously now behind a lot of the color revolutions that we saw in the past decade. So when someone like that speaks up about this, I don't see it as some sort of crystal ball gazing so much as more like an intention that he wants to follow through on. And that should be at least something that we should take into account, because obviously he has the type of political and economic leverage to make things like that happen.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, Soros has tried to profit off warmongering in the past, and he's done some many other shady business deals too. My final question for you: you mentioned in another interview I heard that you did about how Chairman Mao, I guess, went to an Ivy League school in the United States, and he was friends with the Rockefellers and other famous bankers, Wall Street banking families here in the United States. Are the bankers, are they massively involved in the Chinese government and the Chinese banks, or have the Chinese started to kick out most of the Western bankers out of the country?
I'm glad you asked that. Yes, I think they are. The top of the Chinese oligarchy is very much ensconced with the American bankers, but I should correct the record on a couple of points there. It wasn't that Mao went to an American Ivy League university, and it's not that he was directly connected in with the Rockefellers, but he was supported by Yale in China, which was an interesting institution that back at the very beginning of Mao's career actually helped him. And in fact, this is something that's bragged about in Yale's own publication, the Yale Daily News, I believe, of February 1972, had a front page article talking about how Yale in China helped the rise of Mao, and they were bragging about it at the time.
I'm sure they took it out now.
Yeah, well, it's kind of crazy to think about, but yes, basically they gave editorial space. They handed over their publication to Mao to basically use as his propaganda vehicle there in the early years before the communist revolution was even a twinkle in his eye. So he started to develop his revolutionary ideology under the auspices of Yale. And then it's interesting to note that after if not the normalization, at least the beginning of the normalization of relations with China in the early 1970s, from that time until the 1990s, I haven't checked through until today, but until that time, every single person who was appointed as an ambassador or in the ambassadorial role to China, except one, was a member not only of Yale, not only a Yalie, but in fact a member of Skull and Bones, the Yale Secret Society. So that's an interesting little connection that ties in with that. But I think more to the point, after Mao was eclipsed by Deng Xiaoping, that's when we saw the real tying in of the Chinese banking sector and economy in with the Western financiers. And we see that quite explicitly in a number of events and meetings and things that took place, but perhaps most explicitly in a 1980 meeting between Rong Yi-ren of CITIC and David Rockefeller that took place at Chase Manhattan Bank, that involved the meeting of 300 leading American businessmen, and eventually they came to the conclusion that they would have to start cooperating with basically the economic rise of China. So this was baked into the cake in 1980, and what we saw, of course, then throughout the 1980s, we saw companies like Bechtel getting in to start the infrastructure, or the building up of the infrastructure that would become the rise of these factories. And then we saw the corporate investment. We saw eventually the placing of R&D and corporate headquarters in Beijing. And all of this infrastructure investment was taking place throughout the 1990s, into the late 1990s, and then suddenly around the year 2000, suddenly we have this incredible boom of the Chinese economy, as if out of nowhere. Of course, it isn't out of nowhere. It's something that's been planned for a very long time, quite strategically, and quite with a lot of careful planning and a lot of forethought. And I think that's an interesting part of this story that often gets neglected and leads to the current condition where we're starting to talk of the China-U.S. situation as if it's a possible type of Cold War scenario, or at least there's certain economic and military tensions that are shaping up in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And it's talked about as if these forces are really, truly rivals. I think there's a much deeper story that's taking place that involves technology transfers to China. Suddenly we see not just that the Chinese PLA, Navy, and Army are becoming more technologically advanced, but that they're copying directly some of the drone technologies and others from these American defense contractors. Either through, I guess, things that have been stolen from Afghanistan and other places, as has been alleged, or through the direct transfer or the theft or cyber theft of these technologies from the West. But whatever way you slice it, China's rise in every possible way has been facilitated by the West, and in types of open relationships like the U.S.-China Business Council and organizations like that don't get a lot of attention, but I think are very much at the heart of this story.
The global supply chain for a lot of military parts and drones and things like that, some of the parts manufacturers are in China, James. It's not like all the parts manufacturers are in the U.S. They still outsource to save money, but I'm sure those plans get pieced together from one factory to another by Chinese government officials, or they're sold or they're copied and things like that. So I mean, trying to save a buck in outsourcing, like people aren't going to adhere to the same type of copyright laws and things like that. I think your point there about this being planned, China joined the World Trade Organization, and obviously the political elites wanted it, and the larger corporations who wanted to outsource a lot of factory jobs, they wanted it. So there was a lot of reasons why they decided that China was going to be a major player starting in the 90s.
That's exactly right. And the rise of the Soviet Union on the back of a lot of technology transfers and economic help that was going on from the West in the early part of the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1920s has been well documented by people like Anthony Sutton. And he was also in the 1980s saying that by the year 2000, we're going to see China as the next rising superpower on the basis of a technology transfer that's happening right now, as he was writing in the 1980s. And lo and behold, around the year 2000, we see the rise of the Chinese dragon. And again, I think that this is part of a well-known historical process of creating the enemies, creating the tension in order to justify everything that goes along with that. And perhaps the easiest way to see that bottom line is here in the Asia-Pacific region, where military spending is just going through the roof. We are seeing increases in military spending by pretty much every government in the region, and of course, this is all on the back of this growing Chinese menace in the South China Sea, East China Sea. So it's important to understand how this system is operating, and the fact that it is, of course, operating in the benefit and for the interests of the same defense contractors who seem to benefit from every single tension that gets created.
Yeah, I read. Have you heard of George Freeman from Stratfor? He's like the CIA finances most of his company. They're one of his main customers, and he came out with this. So he's considered kind of a big government American apologist, a neocon, and he came out with this book called The Next 100 Years, and he's actually predicting that Japan remilitarizes massively, in the next couple decades, and that they'll become like a major, like Cold War type of player with the United States. But he actually thinks China will collapse, and he's talking about, many decades from now that the satellite technology is going to be so amazing that Japan and the United States are going to take turns trying to blow up each other's satellites. But we're kind of already seeing that with the U.S. and China, where China's, testing. We saw a 60-minute special where China, test fired to see if they could launch a surface-to-space missile and take out a U.S. satellite.
Yes, well, sadly, we don't have to speculate about the remilitarization of Japan. That is happening already, and quite remarkably so in this Abe government era that we're living through right now, where we're seeing the literal changing of the Japanese constitution. For people who don't know, it was baked into the cake of the Japanese constitution of the post-war period, the post-war occupation. Article 9 of the constitution is pretty remarkable. As far as I know, there's no other country on the planet that has anything like it in its constitutional documents. It actually prohibits Japan from having an operational offensive military force, deploying military force anywhere in the world for offensive purposes. That's pretty remarkable, and that is now being dismantled by the Abe government, which had sort of a token show committee to come with their decision that, that actually means that we can help out our friends anywhere in the world that we want to for any reason. If our friends are threatened or if they're engaging their forces, we can go help them. So now they're starting to basically rewrite the rules, and as a result, we're seeing the Japanese military budget increasing because, of course, the self-defense force, so-called here, really is a military. It's just not called a military. It's technically comes under the purview of the Japanese police force, but it is a military and it is ready to go. And now they're just making the sort of legal changes that are needed to start using it more, deploying it more offensively throughout the region, which you can say there is a type of logic to it because we've just saw a Chinese military posture review, which just came out and is now talking about not just policing the South China Sea or just passively noting what's going on there. They're now talking about actively preparing for offensive war in the South China Sea. So it's some pretty scary times from that perspective, and I certainly think that militarization is a process that we are seeing happening right now, and it's not something we have to speculate about.
That's very interesting. It's happening sooner than even experts like George Freeman predicted. But in terms of the Japanese culture, I mean, the Japanese have had samurais and ninjas, and they've always prided themselves on being good fighters. Whether it's karate, I took karate for a number of years. So I mean, like, for them to be peaceful permanently for forever, it's the odds were against it. Human nature is that they're gonna want to have some type of military in the future, just especially when they're still one of the top 3 or 4 economies in the world. So for them to legislate away that stuff, like you mentioned, I mean, obviously it was like good that they want peace and things like that, but permanent peace just by legislation, the odds of it being lasting very long were pretty low, I think.
Well, one of the remarkable things about Japanese culture is just how malleable it is, and we've seen that throughout history. But certainly, if you look at the post-war period, where Japanese society just completely did a 180-degree and went from fighting the United States to not only embracing it, but basically completely ingesting U.S. culture and ideas and completely internalizing that. So it's been pretty remarkable. And as a result of that, I think we've seen the change of the Japanese population so that the sort of standard populist viewpoint here is that Japan is a peaceful country. We're a peaceful people. We desire peace, and you see that reflected in Article 9 and things like that. Of course, there has always been a nationalist element here that is still imperialistic in nature and still very much militaristic in ambitions, but I'd say the majority default position of polite society here in Japan is we are a peaceful country. So that, I think, really has been part of the Japanese consciousness for a very long time. And so now we have Abe coming along, playing to that nationalist base and trying to expand it as much as possible to push through this militarist agenda. And it's still, I think, an open question how far and how fast he'll be able to do it. But certainly it seems that more and more people here are becoming receptive to that as they start to see China as a growing threat.
I really enjoyed this discussion. I want to thank you very much for your time. Please tell our listeners more about the Corbett report. And you put out a documentary last year, right?
That's right. Century of Enslavement, The History of the Federal Reserve, a 90-minute documentary about the Federal Reserve System, which I am pleased to say has now had a few 100,000 views on YouTube and a couple 100,000 downloads from my own site. Not bad for a 90-minute documentary about monetary policy and history, so I'm very proud about that. If people want to check that out, it's available completely free on YouTube, or you can go to my website, corbettreport.com, to get the hyperlinked transcript and the video, MP3 download of audio. I have thousands of hours of audio and video, MP3, MP4 media to download and completely freely available off of my website. And I also contribute to, as I say, the International Forecaster newsletter at theinternationalforecaster.com. I also contribute video reports for GRTV, Global Research TV, and the Boiling Frogs Post. All of that linked up at my site. I also have a Fukushima website, fukushimaupdate.com, where we keep track of the latest information there if people are interested.
Well, I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think our listeners do want that information on Japan and Fukushima, because I think the Japanese might be some of the people who are buying these U.S. treasuries with currency swaps and things like that. So I think it's important for Americans who only, there's a lot of Americans out there who only view America as the most important country in the world. Well, the U.S., they need to learn that China and Japan, about their trading partners. I think it's important to learn about the other cultures and how the other large economies in the world.
I think the 21st century is going to be largely centered on the Asia Pacific, so I think it would be in the best interest of a lot of people to become familiar with this region.
I agree. I think the Asian culture, there's a lot of savings. They're buying metal. In general, they just kind of like producing more than they consume and saving the difference. So, even though their leaders might be Keynesian, the people on the street, on Main Street there, they're not Keynesian, so they tend to have common sense because they don't have all these government programs and things like that and they don't really have huge entitlement, I guess, attitudes.
Generally true, but, obviously it's a question of how it's going to play out, and I think whatever happens, it's going to be interesting to see.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, and I'd like to have you back on in the future. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Anytime you need me. Thank you for having me, Jason.